There is one front and one battle where everyone in the United States, every man, woman, and child, is in action. That front is right here at home, in our daily lives and in our daily tasks. Franklin Roosevelt.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here. And today we'll look at the American home front during World War II. The Second World War was a massive human undertaking. More than 70 million soldiers took part in the action, which played out across 5 continents. And because World War II was a total war in which countries dedicated the entirety of their resource pool to the effort, the conflict had enormous effects on civilian society. Today, we'll catalog some of those effects. But first, let's ask a big question. Did the United States live up to the ideals for which it fought during World War II? In American popular memory, World War II is often remembered as the Good War. Unlike many military conflicts in which the United States has engaged, there is little debate among historians over whether or not American involvement was just and righteous. The fascists in Europe threatened the lives and liberties of their own people as well as their neighbors. The expansive nature of all 3 Axis powers undermined self-government and threatened democracy's very survival. They had to be stopped. FDR's For Freedom speech helped Americans to realize this, and the American citizenry made incredible sacrifices in the interest of freedom and democracy around the world. But at home, America remained an imperfect and, at times, contradictory society. As they had been in World War I, civil liberties were again restricted in the name of national security. The government ratcheted up economic controls, and civil unrest dominated race relations. As one historian wrote, the world's greatest democracy fought the world's greatest racist with a segregated army. So which side wins out? The noble sacrifices of the American people in the name of freedom, or their failure to uphold the very ideals they supposedly cherished? Let's take a complete look at the American home front, then you decide. Our first big idea deals with the American economy during the Second World War. The total war economy pulled the United States out of the Great Depression. As it had in World War I, the government took drastic steps to control the wartime economy and conserve resources at home. Even more so than World War I, World War II required the mobilization of all American resources. In the last lecture, we discussed how American men and women were recruited to the armed forces and called into factories to meet industrial demands. The federal government took unprecedented control of the industrial economy. The War Production Board was established to manage critical war industries. The Office of War Mobilization helped to set production priorities based on the needs of U.S. forces. And the most invasive new agency was the Office of Price Administration, which froze prices for goods and raw materials, controlled rents and wages, and rationed critical commodities. While World War I resource conservation was largely based on volunteerism, it was compulsory in World War II. Citizens were issued ration cards that limited their ability to purchase goods like meat, sugar, gasoline, and rubber. Food conservation was again an area of emphasis. Despite the rationing of critical foodstuffs, prices climbed. The National Wartime Nutrition Program was established to attack the food crisis in 3 main ways. First, it launched an anti-waste campaign to conserve food resources. Second, it encouraged the cultivation of homegrown victory gardens. This effort was particularly successful, as historians estimate that 30 to 40% of all American produce grown during the war came from private and residential gardens. Third, the agency encouraged a balanced diet in order to reduce demand on meat and grain products and to improve overall health. After all, healthy bodies made better soldiers than unhealthy ones. As it had in World War I, the government relied on 2 mechanisms to raise money for the war. FDR explained in a fireside chat the need to raise taxes in order to fund the military. And the government again encouraged the sale of war bonds to generate cash flow. The United States also accelerated the deficit spending that had begun during the Great Depression. The national debt increased 5-fold between 1941 and 1945. Through all of these efforts, the government relied on propaganda initiatives in order to corner public opinion and keep Americans pulling in the same direction. These efforts were largely successful. They appealed to Americans' sense of duty and patriotism, while also playing on their fears of fascism and tyranny. Now, we should note that while most Americans stepped up and made sacrifices in the interest of their country, not all Americans experienced the war in the same way. This is our second big idea. Despite serving with distinction in all theaters of the war, racial minorities faced continued hardship, both in the military and in civilian life. While Hitler was busy forging a race-based empire in Europe, the United States continued to struggle with its own racist tendencies. In the private sphere, people of color continued to face economic discrimination. Black unemployment was disproportionately high during the Great Depression, and at the war's outset, many industries refused to hire African Americans. However, at the prodding of civil rights leaders, FDR intervened. He created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which forced defense contractors to hire African Americans. But unfortunately, this protection was only temporary, and many African American workers lost their jobs when white soldiers returned from forward areas. In the military, African Americans drafted into the armed forces served in segregated units and were often treated like second-class citizens within the ranks. Still, hundreds of thousands signed up of their own accord, and black soldiers served with distinction in every major theater of the war. Notable examples include the Tuskegee Airmen, fighter pilots who earned valor escorting U.S. bombers on raids in southern Italy. Despite their maltreatment, African Americans remained dedicated to the Allied cause. They rallied around the Double V campaign. The Double V campaign held that African Americans sought two victories in World War II: victory against America's enemies abroad, and also victory over racism and discrimination at home. And while people of color continued to suffer discrimination after the war's end, historians do identify the war as a starting point for the modern civil rights movement. As they had done in every previous war, African American soldiers demonstrated incredible resolve and commitment to the American principles of freedom and equality, even though they had yet to fully experience it for themselves. Another ethnic minority group that faced hardship during the war were Japanese Americans. Following the attacks at Pearl Harbor, intense anti-Japanese sentiments arose. The paranoia over Japanese espionage ascended all the way to the White House, and in February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forced Japanese immigrants and American citizens of Japanese descent into concentration camps in California, Utah, and other western states. These American citizens were stripped of their civil liberties without cause and forced to abandon their homes and businesses to live in guarded prison camps. 2/3 of those imprisoned under the executive order were born in the United States, with few, if any, ties to Imperial Japan. The camps were crowded, secluded, and poorly managed. Nearly 2,000 died from disease in the barracks. And while the goal of the American policy was internment, not extermination, we can see the parallels between the imprisonment of Japanese people in the United States and that of Jews in Europe. Civil rights lawyers challenged the constitutionality of the policy, and the issue was taken before the Supreme Court in 1944. In the case of Korematsu versus United States, the justices upheld the executive order, arguing that civil liberties could be restricted in the interest of national security, a decision that echoed the High Court's ruling in Schenck versus United States during World War I. One of the only ways out of the prison camps for Japanese Americans was military service, and nearly 33,000 answered the call. Like African Americans, Japanese American soldiers served with distinction. Incredibly, and perhaps a little ironically, Japanese American soldiers were instrumental in the liberation of the Nazi concentration camp at Dachau in 1945. Back at home, Japanese Americans remained prisoners until the end of the war. They waited until 1988 for a formal apology from the federal government, which included modest reparations for victims and their descendants. Other minority groups worth noting as part of the World War II story are Latino Americans and American Indians. Nearly 500,000 Latinos served in the U.S. military. However, back at home, tensions between whites and Latinos were elevated throughout the country. This is best exemplified by the 1943 Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. Zoot suits were a fashion trend born in the dance clubs of the 1920s and 30s. They were long and baggy, designed to accentuate popular dances of the time. But the style was predominantly popular among Black and Latino communities, leading to a race-based animosity towards the fashion. When World War II began, wool and cloth products were in short supply. Many white Americans thus viewed the zoot suit as wasteful and unpatriotic, though this was largely a veil for racism. In 1943, tensions between U.S. servicemen stationed in Los Angeles and the Latino community devolved into full-scale rioting. Amazingly, no one was killed, but white U.S. servicemen moved through the streets of L.A., attacking and beating any zoot suiter they could find. The city of Los Angeles was forced to take drastic action, first banning the wearing of zoot suits and eventually banning U.S. servicemen from the city. Another minority group worth noting here are Native Americans. Despite centuries of mistreatment by the U.S. government, Native Americans served at a higher rate than any other group. Nearly 1 in 3 American Indian men served in U.S. forces. Of particular note were members of the Navajo tribe, who used their native language, unknown to Europeans, to communicate messages across enemy lines. They were known as the Navajo Code Talkers. The contribution of diverse people to the Allied war effort proved in the eyes of many that World War II was not a war for white America, but one for all Americans who believed in freedom and democracy, even those who had not yet experienced it on the home front. Besides race, the Second World War also had measurable effects on gender roles in the United States. This is our third big idea. During World War II, women experienced changes in employment, pay, fashion, and self-image. You'll remember that the 1920s was an important decade for women. They found new jobs, achieved a new degree of independence, and were empowered for the first time with the vote. Thanks to World War II, the early 1940s provided opportunity for another step forward. We discussed in the last lecture the military service opportunities that opened to women during the war. Many served as test pilots and logistical support in the various branches of the armed forces. Women also went to work in munitions factories during World War II, filling vacancies that were left by men joining the service. These industrial jobs offered better wages than the clerical and secretarial jobs that women had dominated during the 20s and 30s. The hands-on nature of this work also led to changes in fashion, as women began dressing more practically, trading skirts and dresses for pants, and trading hair curlers for scarves. And all of these changes resulted in a new self-image for many women. The iconic propaganda poster of Rosie the Riveter has been a symbol of feminism and female empowerment ever since the war. The essence of this new self-image and self-confidence was perhaps best captured by an unknown female industrial worker who remarked in the 1940s, "I could never handle the simplest can openers or drive a nail without getting hurt. And now I put in half my nights armed with hammers and wrenches, handling the insides of giant machines." And while many of these changes in gender roles and expectations only lasted as long as the war, they provided important groundwork for many feminist movements that came later. In one way or another, World War II touched nearly every aspect of American society, and its legacy was felt long after the fighting stopped. This is our final big idea. Technological advances spurred by the war had lasting impacts in American society. It was no accident that World War II witnessed a number of significant scientific and technological advancements. The urgency of the military situation led both sides to invest heavily in the research and development of new technologies. After the war ended, many of these technologies found applications in civilian life. The proliferation of air power during World War II led to the rapid development of radar technology, which had a huge impact after the war in meteorology. Radar technology was also used to improve televisions, which became household items in the 1950s. Modern computer technology began in earnest during the war as part of the British effort to crack the German Enigma code, an effort that ultimately succeeded. The antibiotic penicillin was developed in 1939 and mass-produced for the first time during the war to control infections in soldiers. Its rapid proliferation led to the development of other antibiotics in the years and decades that followed. The first jet engines were built during the war to gain a tactical advantage in the skies, and these engines soon revolutionized military and civilian aviation. The Germans pioneered rocket technology that formed the basis for space exploration in the 1950s and 60s. And of course, the Manhattan Project led to the first atomic bomb, ushering in the nuclear age, but also laying the groundwork for nuclear power plants, which account for about 20% of U.S. power supply today. The Allied victory in World War II was, on the whole, a triumph of humanity. In the United States, the coordinated effort it required was nothing short of miraculous. That so many diverse groups contributed to the Allied victory is a testament to the depth of their belief in the American principles for which they fought. The sacrifices in lifestyle and in life itself serve as examples to us all and remind us why the men and women who saw the country through this crisis are remembered as the greatest generation. But the stories of World War II also remind us that America, though perhaps righteous in its international goals, was not perfect, and not yet a shining example of the freedom for which the war was ultimately fought. Rather, World War II was but one chapter in our push for progress that is yet unfinished. Next time, we'll move into the nuclear age with a discussion of the origins of the Cold War and the 1950s. See you then.